Welcome to our Metastatic Breast Cancer podcast for December, where our theme for this month is on acknowledging suffering. And we will be focused on the same book that we talked about last month, which is No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And this, as you all know, is one of my favorite books on mindfulness, as it is accessible and gives us tangible solutions and ways within which we can transform our suffering. So Thich Nhat Hanh says the first step in the art of transforming suffering is to come home to our suffering and recognize it. Now, for many of us, and most of us really, there's always a mental discourse going on day and night in our heads. We relive the past, we worry about the future, we don't stop to take a breath to even notice if we're suffering, until suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, the suffering overwhelms us. Our thinking, perceiving, and worrying take away all the peace and space inside of us. And this keeps us from being in touch with what's happening moment to moment, which is why the importance of being fully present as much as we can in our daily lives is truly pivotal to feeling more peace and balance. So if we try to distract or ignore ourselves from our suffering, we often end up making the suffering worse. We turn on the television, we talk or text, we get on the internet, we scroll through social media. We find multiple ways to distract us. When we cut ourselves off from the pain in our mind, we're also abandoning our bodies where suffering is being stored. When we feel loneliness and despair, we seek to cover that up and pretend it's not there. We don't feel very well inside, so in order to forget, we go and look for something to distract us, whether it's going out, constantly socializing, adding to the to-do list, eating, whatever it is. We become addicted to these distractions, trying to cover up our suffering within. And the real root of the problem is left unaddressed. And let's talk for a moment here about electronic distractions. And Thich Nhat Hanh here says, we can become addicted to computer games or other kinds of audiovisual entertainment. Electronic distractions not only fail to help heal the underlying suffering, they may contain stories or images that feed our craving, jealousy, anger, or despair. Instead of making us feel better, they numb us only briefly, then make us feel worse. To consume in order to cover up our suffering doesn't work. We need a spiritual practice to have the strength and skill to look deeply into our suffering, to get insight into it and make a breakthrough. So the next step here is, how do we stop and acknowledge suffering? So when suffering arises, the first thing to do is to stop, to follow our breathing and acknowledge it. So I want you all now to take a moment to do this simple practice with me. Don't try to deny uncomfortable emotions or push them down. So just take a moment here to breathe in and to silently say to yourself, I know suffering is there. And then now to breathe out and to silently say to yourself, I say hello to my suffering. So let's do that 2 more times. Breathing in, I know suffering is there. Breathing out, I say hello to my suffering. Breathing in, I know suffering is there. Breathing out, I say hello to my suffering. To take one mindful breath requires the presence of our mind, our body, and our intention. With our conscious breath, we reunite our body and mind and arrive in the present moment. Just breathing in mindfully already brings us a surprising amount of freedom. With each breath, we generate mindful energy, bringing mind and body together in the present moment to receive this caring acknowledgement of our suffering. In just 2 or 3 breaths taken with your full attention, you may notice that regret and sorrow about the past have paused, as well as uncertainty, fear, and worries about the future. And so much of our suffering comes from replaying the past or thinking about the future, and often projecting negatively into the future. So how do we pause this suffering? Thich Nhat Hanh teaches us that we have to bring the body and mind together. Each of us has a body, but we aren't always in touch with it. Maybe our body needs us. Our body is calling us, but we don't hear it. We're so caught up in our job, our lives, our computer, our phone, our conversations, and we often forget we even have a body. If we can get in touch with our body, then we can also get in touch with our feelings. There are many feelings calling to us. Every feeling is like our child. Suffering is a hurt child crying out to us, but we ignore the voice of the child within. The process of healing begins when we mindfully breathe in. In daily life, very often, our body is here, but our mind is off in the past, in the future, or in our projects. The mind is not with the body. When we breathe in and focus our attention on our in-breath, we reunite body and mind. We become aware of what is going on in the present moment, in our body, in our perceptions, and around us. When we bring our mind home to our body, something wonderful happens. Our mental discourse stops its chattering. Thinking can be productive, but the reality is that most of our thinking is unproductive. When we think, it may be easy for us to be lost in our thinking, but when we use our breath to bring our mind home to the body, we can stop the thinking. When you come back to yourself and breathe mindfully, your mind's attention has only one object, your breath. If you continue to breathe in and out mindfully, you maintain that state of presence and freedom. Your mind will be clearer and you will make better decisions. It's much better to make a decision when your mind is clear and free, rather than in the sway of fear, anger, frustration, and worry. Thich Nhat Hanh shares that when he was a young monk, he believed that it took a long time to get any kind of insight. The truth is, there are insights that can come right away. When you practice mindfulness of breathing, you know right away that you are alive and that to be alive is a wonder. If you can be aware that you have a living body and notice when there's tension in your body, that's already an important insight. With that insight, you have already begun to diagnose the situation. You don't need to practice 8 years or 20 years in order to wake up. Breathing mindfully isn't something hard to do. You don't have to suffer while breathing. You're already doing it all day long. You don't need to struggle to control your breathing. In fact, breathing in can become a real pleasure. You just allow yourself to breathe in naturally while focusing your attention on your in-breath. It's like the morning sunshine on a flower that has closed overnight. The sunshine doesn't interfere with the flower. The sunshine just embraces and subtly permeates the flower. The sunshine is embracing of this energy and the flower begins to bloom. When we stop the busyness of the mind and come back to ourselves, the enormity and rawness of our suffering can seem very intense because we are so used to ignoring it and distracting ourselves. When we feel suffering, we have the urge to run away from it and fill ourselves up with all of the distractions that we've talked about. Anything to keep our mind off the pain that is there inside us. This simply doesn't work. We may succeed in numbing ourselves from it for a little while, but the suffering inside wants our attention and it will fester and churn away until it gets it. We run away from ourselves because we don't want to be with ourselves. Our pain is a kind of energy that is not pleasant. We fear that if we release our diversions and come back to ourselves, we'll be overwhelmed by the suffering, despair, anger, and loneliness inside. So we continue to run away. But if we don't have the time and the willingness to take care of ourselves, how can we offer any genuine care to the people we love? That's why the first practice is to stop running. Come home to our bodies and recognize our suffering. When we notice anger or anxiety coming up, we can recognize these feelings of suffering. Suffering is one energy. Mindfulness is another energy that we can call upon to come and embrace our suffering. The practice of mindful breathing is essential because it provides us with the energy we need for the other steps of taking care of suffering. With mindful breathing that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, you can recognize the presence of a painful feeling. Just like an older sibling greets a younger sibling, you can say, "Hello, my suffering. I know you are there." In this way, the energy of mindfulness keeps us from being overwhelmed by painful feelings. We can even smile to our suffering and say, "Good morning, my pain, my sorrow, my fear. I see you. I am here. Don't worry." If we let the suffering come up and just take over our mind, we can be quickly overwhelmed by it. So we have to invite another energy to come up at the same time. And this is the energy of mindfulness. The function of mindfulness is first to recognize the suffering and then to take care of the suffering. The work of mindfulness is first to recognize the suffering and second to embrace it. A mother taking care of a crying baby naturally will take the child into her arms without suppressing, judging it, or ignoring the crying. Mindfulness is like that mother, recognizing and embracing suffering without judgment. So the practice is not to fight or suppress the feeling, but rather to cradle it with a lot of tenderness. When a mother embraces her child, that energy of tenderness begins to penetrate into the body of the child. Even if the mother doesn't understand at first why the child is suffering, and she needs some time to find out what the difficulty is, just her act of taking the child into her arms with tenderness can already bring relief. If we too can recognize and cradle our suffering while we breathe mindfully, there is relief already. Embracing our suffering may seem to be the opposite of what we want to do, especially if our suffering is very large, as with depression. Depression is one of the most widespread forms of suffering in our time. It can take away our peace, our joy, our stability, and even our ability to eat, move about, or do simple tasks. It can seem insurmountable, and we may think that the only thing we can do is either to run away from it or give in to it. But non-judgmentally recognizing and embracing this great suffering is not at all the same thing as giving in to it. Once you have offered your acknowledgement and care to this suffering, it naturally will become less impenetrable and more workable. And then you have the chance to look into it deeply with kindness, but still always with a solid ground of mindful breathing to support you, and find out why it has come to you. It is trying to get your attention, to tell you something, and now you can take the opportunity to listen. So I hope that you will all join us for our Metastatic Breast Cancer Mindfulness Group in December, where we will discuss this podcast in more detail, of embracing our suffering, of acknowledging our suffering, and we will engage in some meditation and mindfulness practices that can help and support us. I hope to see you then.